Evan Hale always claimed he wasn't the kind of person who made reckless decisions, but that afternoon, standing in the fading light of a winter-orange sky, he realized he had become someone he barely recognized. The words he had just thrown at the Black Lantern still echoed in his mind, louder than the street noise around him. "I challenge you. Break me if you can." It wasn't bravery. It wasn't defiance. It was desperation shrouded in a thin shell of boldness, and Evan felt its weight pressing against his ribs as he stood alone before the group known for their cold, merciless demeanor that he didn't even fully understand why he had said it. Maybe it was the weeks of silence at home with Marcus Voss, the man he loved but could no longer seem to reach. Maybe it was the hollow feeling that had begun spreading in his chest every time Marcus walked past him without meeting his eyes. Or maybe it was the quiet fear that had begun whispering that he was no longer enough for the person he had built his life around. Whatever the reason, Evan knew one thing with certainty: he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The alley behind Bridgeway Market was narrow, uneven, and dim, lit only by a flickering sign from an old coffee shop and the last slivers of daylight. The gang stood in a loose semicircle, their expressions ranging from amusement to mild curiosity. No one moved at first. They simply stared at him, as if waiting for him to explain himself, or collapse under the weight of his own impulsivity, and then Evan noticed someone he hadn't seen when he first stepped into the alley. A man stood slightly apart from the group, leaning against a brick wall with the relaxed posture of someone who had nothing to prove. His presence was quiet but commanding. His eyes, a sharp gray that reflected everything and revealed nothing, were fixed directly on Evan. Calder Knox. Evan didn't know his name yet, but something about the man unsettled him. There was a calm confidence in Calder's stance, a kind of silent authority that the others seemed to defer to without question. His dark jacket was unbuttoned despite the cold, and his expression remained unreadable, neither hostile nor welcoming. Just watchful. Evan swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had come here in a moment of anger, fueled by the ache of feeling invisible in his own home. Marcus had left that morning with barely a nod in Evan's direction, offering a clipped "later" that sounded more like an obligation than affection. Evan had watched Marcus's back disappear through the door and had felt something break quietly inside him. He didn't know if Marcus was drifting away or simply exhausted, but he had known something was wrong. And instead of confronting it, he had run out into the world searching for a way to feel anything other than numb. One of the Black Lanterns, a tall man with a shaved head and a deep scar cutting across his eyebrow, stepped toward him. "Break you?" he repeated, his tone half mocking, half curious. "You walk in here alone and ask for that? You sure you're in the right place?" Evan kept his gaze steady, though he could feel his pulse hammering inside his wrists. "I'm exactly where I meant to be." The shaved-head man laughed, shaking his head. "You're either brave or stupid." Before Evan could respond, Calder pushed off the wall with deliberate ease and walked toward him. The other men stepped aside without being told. Calder stopped just close enough that Evan could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the calm in his eyes, the subtle trace of something like interest, though Evan couldn't be sure. "You don't know what you're asking," Calder said quietly. His voice wasn't threatening. It was measured, almost gentle, but there was an undeniable edge beneath it. "People come here wanting trouble. They usually regret finding it." "I'm not looking for trouble," Evan replied. "I just want something real." Calder's expression flickered, barely, but enough for Evan to notice. "And you think we're the ones who can give you that?" Evan hesitated. He didn't know how to explain the storm inside him, the loneliness, the frustration, the fear that he was losing Marcus without understanding why. So he said nothing. Calder exhaled slowly, studying him. "You're running from something. That much is obvious." The word struck deeper than Evan expected. He felt exposed, as if Calder could see the cracks he tried so hard to keep hidden. Still, he forced a small, tight smile. "Maybe I am." For a long moment, the alley was silent except for the distant hum of traffic. Calder's gaze didn't waver. Then he turned slightly toward the others and gave a subtle shake of his head. The message was clear: leave him alone. "But he challenged us," someone began. He didn't know what he was stepping into. Calder interrupted, his tone final. This isn't his world. Evan bristled at that. You don't get to decide that. No, Calder said softly, but someone should stop you from making a mistake you'll regret. The sincerity in his voice took Evan by surprise. He wasn't used to strangers recognizing his pain, let alone acknowledging it. He felt something shift, a small crack of uncertainty forming in his resolve, then his phone buzzed in his pocket. Evan didn't have to look to know who it was. Marcus. The timing was sharp enough to feel like fate, or maybe punishment. He froze, torn between instinct and resentment. Calder's eyes flicked down to Evan's pocket, then back to his face. You should take that, Calder said, though his tone suggested he already knew Evan wouldn't. Evan didn't move. Calder studied him for another moment, then stepped back. Go home, Evan. Whatever you're fighting, this isn't where you'll win. Evan's breath hitched. How do you know my name? A faint hint of a smile crossed Calder's lips. I make it my business to know who walks into danger. Before Evan could respond, Calder turned away, and the rest of the black lanterns followed him, dispersing like shadows melting back into the dim alley. Evan stood alone once more, the silence pressing in around him. His phone buzzed again, persistent but unanswered. Marcus's name glowed on the screen, but Evan couldn't bring himself to tap it. Not yet. His heartbeat finally began to slow, but his mind did not. Calder's words lingered, circling inside him with unsettling clarity. You're running from something. Maybe Calder was right. Evan slipped his phone back into his pocket, exhaled shakily, and took a step toward the street. He didn't know what he had expected to find here, but the encounter had left him with more questions than answers, and a strange, lingering pull he couldn't explain. As he walked away, the cold evening air brushed against his skin, carrying with it a subtle whisper of uncertainty and the quiet promise that tonight had changed something he wasn't ready to name. And somewhere behind him, hidden in the depths of the alley, Calder Knox watched until Evan disappeared from sight. Evan told himself he wouldn't go back to the bookshop for at least a week. He insisted the encounter with Caleb had been nothing more than an ordinary moment dressed up by loneliness. But by the next afternoon, he found himself reaching for the very book Caleb had recommended, flipping pages without absorbing a single sentence. His thoughts kept drifting, circling the same memory: Caleb's voice, calm and patient, his smile, warm without demanding anything, the easy way he listened, as if every word Evan spoke deserved space. The next day at work, Evan caught himself rereading old messages from Mark, trying to remember the version of their relationship from years earlier. The texts were short, polite, logistical, nothing resembling the connection he once lived for. He closed the chat window and leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the unspoken loneliness settle deeper into his ribs. That afternoon, a notification flashed across his phone: Caleb Rowan. If you need those 5 minutes today, I'm around. Evan stared at the message, breath lodged halfway in his chest. He hadn't given Caleb his number. Then he remembered the bookshop's loyalty card he'd filled out weeks ago, the stack of community event flyers on the counter, the normal ways people exchanged contact information in places like that. The connection felt personal, but the explanation was ordinary. Innocent, still, the message felt like a door opening. Evan's reply was short: maybe. I'll see. He didn't tell Mark he was leaving work early, not out of malice, but because lately Mark barely registered the difference between Evan being home at 6 or 7. Evan walked to the bookshop through streets painted gold by the setting sun, a feeling of nervous energy threading through every step. He told himself it was just curiosity, just conversation, nothing more. No promises, no secrets. Not yet. The bell chimed as he entered, and he saw Caleb immediately, standing near a display of new releases. Their eyes met, and something wordless passed between them: acknowledgement, recognition, maybe even relief. You came, Caleb said, his voice soft but carrying a hint of something brighter. Just for a few minutes, Evan replied. 5, apparently. Caleb laughed, and the sound reached Evan like a warm hand on a cold shoulder. 5 minutes can be a long time, he said. Longer than people think. Evan wasn't sure whether it was a joke, a warning, or an invitation. Maybe it was all three. That they walked to a quieter corner of the store where the traffic of customers thinned. Caleb didn't push, didn't rush. He simply asked how Evan's week had been. Evan talked more than he meant to, describing work frustrations, the growing distance with Mark, the sense of invisibility that had crept into his daily life. He heard himself admitting things he hadn't even told himself clearly. Caleb listened the way Mark used to, focused, unhurried, with a steady presence that made silence feel safe rather than awkward. Sometimes, Caleb said thoughtfully, people drift apart without realizing it. Not because they stop caring, but because they stop paying attention. Evan felt the truth of that sentence scrape against something tender inside him. He looked down at the book in his hands, unable to meet Caleb's eyes for a moment. I don't want to be unfair to Mark, Evan said quietly. He's exhausted. He's trying. And so are you, Caleb replied. You deserve someone who notices that. The truth hit harder than Evan expected. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the words settle, their meaning deeper than their simplicity. Their conversation stretched beyond the promised 5 minutes. Time slipped past them, unnoticed, as if the clock itself didn't want to interrupt. Evan realized, with a sudden rush of clarity, that this was the first hour in months he felt fully present, fully awake. When he finally checked the time, he exhaled sharply. I should go, he said. Really? Caleb nodded, but his eyes held a softness that made Evan's chest tighten. I don't want to complicate your life, Caleb said. But I also don't want you to disappear from mine. Evan looked at him, trying to steady the sudden rush of emotion. I'm not disappearing, he said. I just don't know what I'm doing. You don't have to know, Caleb replied. Not today. Evan stepped back, creating a space he felt obligated to maintain. But his feet refused to move further. Something kept him anchored there, suspended between who he was and who he might become. The air felt charged with meaning, though nothing inappropriate had been said or implied. It was just the intensity of two people standing on the edge of an emotional shift they couldn't fully articulate. Finally, Evan tore himself from the moment and walked toward the exit. Caleb followed silently, stopping just before the door. Hey, Caleb said, his voice gentler now. If it ever gets too heavy, you don't have to carry it alone. Evan nodded, swallowing hard. Thank you. He stepped outside, the cool air brushing his face like a reminder of reality. He walked down the street with brisk, anxious steps, trying to make sense of the whirlwind in his chest. He felt guilty, but also strangely alive, an emotional tug-of-war he couldn't name. When he reached home, Mark was sitting at the table, eyes half-drooped with exhaustion. Long day? Evan asked. You have no idea, Mark mumbled, rubbing his temples. Can we just skip talking tonight? I'm drained. Evan forced a smile, nodding. Sure. He sat across from Mark, feeling invisible even while staring directly at him. The contrast between the silence here and the connection he'd felt an hour earlier made his stomach twist. He wanted to tell Mark that something was wrong, that he felt himself slipping away, that something needed to change. But Mark was already asleep on his forearms. Evan watched him for a long moment, heart heavy with conflicting loyalties. He pulled a blanket over Mark's shoulders, just as he always did, but his hands shook slightly. That night, lying awake in the dim bedroom, Evan replayed the conversation with Caleb in careful fragments. He dissected each glance, each pause, each loaded silence. The emotional intimacy had crossed no physical line, yet the impact felt undeniable. He opened his phone, staring at the message thread with Caleb. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he typed nothing. Instead, Caleb texted first, did the 5 minutes help? Evan closed his eyes and let the truth wash through him. More than I expected, he wrote back. There was no immediate response, but the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like a door that had been cracked open, letting in a sliver of light. A sliver Evan wasn't sure he should want, yet couldn't bring himself to push away. Evan woke the next morning with a sense of quiet unease. The previous night's encounter lingered in his thoughts, not the laughter or the polite introductions, but the way Caleb's attention had softened when Liam entered the room. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible to anyone else, yet it struck Evan with the force of recognition. Something had shifted, and it was no longer confined to hushed glances or missed conversations at a tea breakfast. Caleb seemed distracted, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly as though he were mentally elsewhere. He smiled at Evan when spoken to, but the warmth felt delayed, filtered through an invisible veil. Evan chose not to comment immediately, instead watching the familiar movements, the way Caleb's hand lingered near his mug a moment longer than necessary, and the faint crease between his brows that hadn't been there before. "You're quiet today," Caleb remarked, finally breaking the tension with a casual tone. "Just thinking," Evan said, letting his words hang. "About work, life, whatever." Caleb nodded, but his eyes flicked toward the phone charging on the counter. Evan noticed how quickly Caleb's gaze returned to his plate, almost as if he were guarding his own attention. Something about the timing felt deliberate. Not malicious, not deceitful, but careful. Careful enough that Evan sensed a deeper story simmering beneath the surface. The day unfolded with its usual rhythm, Evan working from home, Caleb disappearing for meetings and phone calls, the silence between them stretching thin. Yet even in the routine, Evan detected subtle changes. Caleb's messages were shorter, his laughter lighter, almost rehearsed. Evan wondered whether he imagined it, or whether Caleb was consciously building a wall he hadn't yet acknowledged. By evening, Evan decided he could no longer ignore the feeling. He suggested a walk through the neighborhood, hoping that movement and fresh air would loosen the invisible tension. Caleb agreed, seemingly without hesitation, but Evan noted the brief hesitation in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed as they stepped out into the cool twilight. They walked side by side, passing familiar streets and streetlights casting long shadows. Evan chose his words carefully, cautious not to confront, only to invite. "Are you happy?" he asked. Caleb's stride faltered, and he glanced at Evan briefly before looking ahead. "I think so. Some days are better than others." Evan didn't press, though he sensed the avoidance. He had learned over the years that pressing too hard often led to walls, not answers. Still, he couldn't shake the sense that Caleb's quiet wish, the one he carried like a secret weight, was becoming more tangible, more insistent. A few days later, Evan noticed a new pattern: Caleb leaving the house with his laptop bag in the morning, returning later than he claimed, his energy slightly elevated after long phone calls. Evan observed the changes in small increments, cataloging each as if they were puzzle pieces, hoping they would form a coherent picture. But they did not. Instead, they created tension, unease, and the persistent hum of suspicion. Then, one afternoon, Evan discovered a small, folded note tucked under a stack of mail. The handwriting was unmistakable, Caleb's. He hesitated before unfolding it, unsure whether he wanted to read it or leave it for another day. But curiosity, mingled with fear. The note was brief, almost fragile. "I wish I could tell you everything. But I don't know if I can. I hope you'll understand someday." Evan's hands trembled slightly as he refolded the paper. Nothing explicit, nothing detailed, just a quiet admission of longing, a confession that something unspoken existed between them. The words confirmed what Evan had suspected all along: Caleb carried a wish, a desire, a thought he hadn't yet shared. But the note offered no clarity on whether that wish included Evan or someone else entirely. The tension in the house grew heavier after that. Evan began noticing Caleb's subtle gestures toward Liam, the way Caleb's voice brightened when he spoke of project deadlines that coincided with Liam's visits, or the way he lingered on Liam's messages, smiling softly when reading them alone in another room. Evan didn't want to confront, didn't want to accuse. But he couldn't ignore the evidence his own heart and mind were piecing together. One evening, Evan found himself alone in the living room, scrolling through his own thoughts more than any actual messages. He realized that Caleb's affection for him was still there. It hadn't disappeared, but it was shaded now, filtered through unspoken emotions. The man he loved was struggling between the life they had built and a desire he hadn't shared. And the longer it remained unsaid, the further Evan felt himself from the person he thought he knew. When Caleb returned home that night, he seemed restless. The usual calmness was replaced by a subtle energy, a vibration Evan could feel when he stepped into the room. Caleb spoke softly, almost cautiously. "Evan. I need to tell you something. Evan's stomach tightened. He had waited for this moment, dreaded it, and hoped for it all at once. Okay, he said. His voice was steady, but his pulse raced. Caleb hesitated, his eyes searching Evan's face as if measuring how much of the truth could be revealed without shattering them both. Then, just as he began to speak, a notification chimed on his phone. Caleb's expression shifted, and he turned away, swiping the screen with practiced ease. I'll tell you later, Caleb murmured. Evan swallowed the disappointment, sensing that the conversation he needed most would be delayed again. The night continued with polite routine, dinner, laughter faintly forced, an early retreat to separate rooms. But the weight of Caleb's unspoken words pressed down on Evan, heavier than anything he could have imagined. As Evan lay awake, he replayed every interaction, every glance, every smile Caleb had given Liam in recent days. The images weren't dramatic, not threatening, but they were intimate in a way only emotional connection can be. Evan understood, with a painful clarity, that Caleb's quiet wish was no longer a vague thought, it had taken form, and its gravity reached far beyond the walls of their apartment. By the time dawn broke, Evan made a silent promise to himself: he would confront the truth, whatever it was. He didn't yet know how, or when, or what he would find. But he knew that the quiet wish Caleb carried would not remain hidden much longer, and that when it surfaced, nothing would ever be the same. It was no longer just tension or distance. It was a turning point, and Evan felt it in the hollow ache of anticipation, the awareness that love and longing can coexist, even when their paths diverged. He closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable, knowing that the coming days would force choices, revelations, and consequences he could no longer avoid. And with that understanding came the first real stirrings of fear, hope, and a fragile courage he didn't yet fully recognize.